Alrighty, so we're back to do the ceiling fan, the last of our videos for Project 4. Now, of course, this is a new model, so we do want to download an image. This is the ceiling fan I've picked, right? I'll make sure to upload it for you guys. Sometimes I upload them, sometimes I don't, because sometimes the stuff's generic enough that, you know, kind of picking your own is fine. In this case, a lot of fans will be fine, but definitely something more like this one, right? These guys are going to be a little trickier to do, believe it or not, so I would kind of stay away from the really, really super modern ones. And one of the things I'd really, really like you to do is to try to have like some kind of metal brace. It doesn't have to be metal, it could be like another kind of wood or plastic, but some kind of brace that connects to the fan. And I'd like it to have kind of some kind of asymmetry or like unique shape. Because I do want to kind of get you guys to use another feature of multi-cut, right? We use slice on our room, right, when we did our door trim, and that's a great place to see kind of when slice would be useful. And we've used regular, you know, control for inserting edge loops for multi-cut a bunch, because that's awesome, and that's what you're going to use multi-cut for, honestly, a lot of the time, a large majority of the time. But there, you can actually manually cut, right? I've hinted at it, teased it a little bit, but I really want you guys to do that. So it doesn't have to be exactly this fan, although I will upload it for you. But it should have a couple of fan blades coming off. It should kind of have some kind of brace part that's got some unique shape to it. Ideally asymmetrical would be cool, like this. And of course, kind of some kind of main kind of cylindrical shape. Because that'll kind of allow us to do everything that's in the video. So usually I like you guys to find stuff that's either very much like mine, or in some cases, like with the clock radio, I wanted it to be exactly the one. It's actually in Canvas. You can download it from the files section, right? Kind of showed that all in the videos. Because it isn't just, oh, make a fan, right? It's make one that really demonstrates or has you use the tools I'm showing in the videos, right? That's the whole purpose of the class in many respects, is to get you to build a variety of cool things, but also at the same time demonstrate tools and actually have to use tools to get to know what they do. So in this case, what I'm going to do is, of course, I've already got Project 4, so I don't have to create a new project here, but I do need to save this in there. So of course, you know, I can save image as, and give it a moment here. And of course, I think that should be Project 4 because it's got the most recent date. So we'll open that up. We can see it as Project 4. And of course, we go to source images, right? This is one of the cool things about creating projects, is it gives you a bunch of folders that you can put different stuff in. And that way you can easily just grab that Project 4, move it to a different computer, put it on your flash drive if you need to. And it contains all the stuff related to that project. So in this case, I'll just kind of name that fan. There we go. Keep in mind that usually your image formats are fine, but occasionally, sometimes image file formats, when you download them, will save, you think it's going to save as a JPEG, and it saves as something quite different. So sometimes if you're having a problem with a reference image loading in, that actual image file format, for whatever reason, was coded differently, you're just going to have to find a new one, right? So in this case, it should be fine. So I'll hit save. But basically a fan fairly similar to this one. It's not be identical to this one, but you know, it should have a couple fan blades, should have kind of some kind of metal brace that attaches to it that's got some kind of unique shape. Just a square is kind of lame. Guys, don't do a square one, right? That you don't have to use the multi-cut in a unique way to do the square ones. So try to find something that's got some curvature. Ideally, maybe a little bit of asymmetry to it. And then, of course, something kind of like a lamp shape for this, right? Which a lot of those have, right? All right. So I'm going to close that up. And at this point, right, we're going to go File, Set Project, right? File, Set Project, because we're not creating a new project, right? We're just setting one. It's still Project 4. So we'll set that as Project 4. There we go. Remember, you don't actually open the folder, you just set it. And then, of course, what we could do is we can load our image reference plane in, right? So we can go Create Free Image Planes, right? And this will actually be the last time we're going to see that. We've seen it a bunch of times already, right? Easily 7 times, I think, right? The only thing I kind of let you just make up was the room, because it's some walls, right? We did 8 models total, and 7 of those 8 we actually have loaded in image planes, right? Because we want to build them to look like the pictures we find. So create free image plane. And of course that loads in the image plane, which is this green square with a green X. Of course you can click off to deselect it. You do have to click on kind of the edges here, the lines, to select it, right? Because if you just click here, it won't. So you have to kind of click on the edges to select it if you deselect it. And then, of course, we go to Attribute Editor, right? Now remember, Control A Control A on your keyboard will actually toggle between your channel box layer editor, which is got your transforms, so the object level stuff, as well as any history, right, that you've done. But it also toggles you to attribute editor. So Control A toggles between those. But of course, they are all right here, kind of on the side, and even these buttons there. So we go to attribute editor. By default, it usually goes to image plane shape 1. If it is on the image plane, you won't see kind of that little folder one, so you just click on that. So in attribute editor, remember, there are these tabs up here, and they're kind of like whatever properties you have, right? It even will show history. So attribute editor will show history like channel box layer editor, but it also shows properties like material properties and these properties, which your channel box layer editor generally doesn't. So your attribute editor is much more like your properties, even though it'll show history. Channel box layer editors for your layer stuff, we'll see it on Project 6, as well as your history as well, and it's kind of like your transforms for the object level stuff. You type in, rotate 45 degrees on the y-axis if you wanted to from your channel box layer editor, right? So attribute editor, that little folder, right? Because that's what's going to allow us to browse for the image. And you notice because we set this to be Project 4, it automatically goes to the source images for Project 4. And there you can see is the fan image, and we can open it. And that's what's great about the projects, right? Is particularly if you have to move your folders, your projects to different computers. When you set a project, it knows where to find these pictures, right? It knows where to find any images you've loaded into Maya. Remember, when you turn in your projects, you have to turn in the picture also, right? It's not saved in Maya, guys, right? I've mentioned this multiple times, but it never hurts to reinforce it. These are not saved in Maya, right? Maya is just finding them outside of itself and loading them in. So when you turn in your projects, turn in those reference images as well. Obviously for the room, we didn't do a reference image, so that one you didn't have to, but remember, you have to turn in your picture references, not just your Maya scenes. All right, so there's our fan. Now in this case, remember, the units right now by default are set centimeters, right? And if you wanted to use centimeters and you wanted just your grid to be a lot bigger, remember, you can go to display, grid, options box, and you can actually tell the units to be a lot higher, right? So you have some properties for your grid there. Just like in display, you also have heads-up display, and that's where you can turn poly count on, right? That shows you kind of this stuff right here, so you can see how many polygons you have, how many triangles, number of selected, all that stuff. As well as just being able to turn off other things if you want to, visibility-wise. All right, so now what we do is we go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, right? And from there, what we do is we go to Settings, right? Because that's where our ability to change our working units is going to be at, right? We've talked about a lot of other things in here, like Files and Projects has your autosave, right? Going further down to undo, your undos are there, your amount of undos. So like remember, there's lots of things in there. Modeling, you can kind of tell your some things to work a little bit differently if you want to, right? Usually the defaults are fine, but you see how you can even control some quad draw properties, right? So just keep that in mind, is that you do have a lot of properties in here. Even selection properties are there. The defaults usually this are fine. All right, so just keep that in mind settings. And we're going to change working units to meter, just so that we don't have to have a really dense grid, right? So we go to meter, save. And now you can see each grid unit is now a meter, right? And a meter is 3 feet. When you think of a ceiling fan's easily going to have, like a 4 to 5 foot diameter, depending on the size of the fan. So this ceiling fan should probably be not quite 2 grid units, but probably closer to 2 grid units in size than not. So remember, it's selected, so I hit R for scale. I can left click drag on that center one, and we'll kind of get it, reasonably close to, 2 grid units. Not quite though. Of course, I'm going to hit W for move as well, because I would like to move it off the 0 of the world. So I usually grab the blue arrow and move it backwards, right? So I don't move in the direction of the blue arrow, I move it the other direction. If I move it this direction, when you go to your front view, it'll be in front of your model, right? So you want to move it that way, so it's not in front of your model. All right, so now we have basically our image loaded in. And what we can do is we can start to build this, right? So now in this case, when we think about it, you can see that you're probably not going to be able to get a lot of perfect side views for this. So remember, part of modeling is you're not always going to have the best reference images. Sometimes you will have great ones, right, and lots of them. Sometimes you won't, right? So you're, to a certain extent, often when you're modeling stuff, interpreting from reference images. So you have to do a little bit of interpretation, but you do want to try to make it as close as possible to the reference image. All right. So in this case, the fans are themselves, the blades are going to be pretty easy. They're going to be some cubes that we're going to create later on, then we'll do a little bit of work to them. But what we're going to start off with is kind of the main shaft here, right? The light and kind of the main fixture that hooks up to the ceiling. And when you look at this, this is basically a cylindrical shape, right? So you could easily make this as a revolve or even using extrude border edge, right? So kind of one of those things where in this case we've done plenty of extrude border edge this term. I'm going to do a revolve again because we really only did that once on the lamp. So in this case, also keep in mind that this is not really centered, right? You can kind of see how this is off. So I'm going to kind of try to center it a little bit better. But remember, there is going to be just a bit of interpretation of this as well. And this might even be one of those instances where, you know, I'll just hit E for rotate on the reference image. Maybe just rotate it a little bit on that axis to maybe try to get it a little bit straighter visually. But remember, this is really kind of about interpretation, right? You're not really going to be able to get it perfect. So don't sweat it too much, right? That should be reasonably close to kind of centered. All right. So remember, if you tap spacebar, right, that takes you out to your 4 views, right? It minimizes your perspective view and it shows your top, front, side, which are your orthographics. Remember, if you go on panels, you can change to orthographic there. Even if you hold down spacebar long enough, right? Remember, it brings up all this. It brings up what's called the hotbox, and it brings up all of your menus, including this Maya one, which if you left click on, you see how you can actually change to left, top, back, front, bottom, right? Perspective. So you can actually change those things around if you want to. But remember, in this case, we kind of have our views, right? So in this case, remember A is fit all, right? F is frame selection, and those work independently for each viewport, right? Just like shaded and wireframe work independent in each viewport. So you can have wireframe in these viewports and shaded in that one if you want to, right? Those are independent. Those quick keys are. See, I can zoom out, hit F, and it doesn't do it for everything, right? So these viewports are independent of each other in that respect, right? They're synced when it comes to selecting things and all that stuff, but certain navigation things. So in this case, I'm going to put my cursor over the front view, right? Tap spacebar, because you'll notice tap spacebar, of course, minimizes a viewport, but it also maximizes a viewport, and it just depends on what viewport your cursor was over. In this case, you can see I probably need to line that up a little bit better there. There we go. It's pretty close. Like I said, you're never really going to get it perfect here, but you know, it never hurts to adjust it a little bit. All right, so there we go. Now, in this case, I want to draw this out, right? And remember, we did that with Create, Curve Tools, CV Curve Tool, right? Create Curve Tools, CV Curve Tool. Now, remember, there are other curve types. I did kind of show those off in previous videos, right? Remember, CV is Control Vertices, EP is EP Curve. They actually behave quite similar, believe it or not. But I just find CV curves are the top. They work quite well. If you wanted the Bezier handle one, you can get that. If you go back to look at earlier videos, we kind of talked about that there. In this case, we'll just use CV Curve Tool. All right. And of course, it gives us this little crosshair, and that means we can just left click to draw this. Now, the same rules that we used for our lamp apply here. And in fact, you'll notice this is basically a lamp shape, isn't it? Bottles are lamp shapes, right? Vases are lamp shapes. Columns for architecture are lamp shapes. A baseball bat's a lamp shape, right? A chess piece, right? So believe it or not, you'll often see revolve kind of done with chess pieces and other things. So we chose a lamp because we're making a room. It made a lot of sense. But any reasonably complicated cylindrical shape you can do quite well with revolves, right? So in this case, I'm just going to left click to make a point. Left click, left click. Remember, by default, you have a 3-degree curve here, right? That means it's you have to create at least 4 points to create the curve. So I'll create that right there. And remember, if you put a couple of points close to each other, it makes the edge there sharper, kind of like with Smooth Preview, right? Edge loops that are close to other edge loops at corners kind of make the shape kind of, it's still doing the rounding, but it makes the rounded the size of the rounded area smaller, so it's sharper. So if I kind of just make sure to put a couple of points there, you'll notice when I go to draw in more of these points further away, see how it kind of keeps that shape a little bit harder with still having a little bit of roundness. Left click. So remember, we just keep left clicking, and we'll kind of put a couple of points there as well, just to kind of keep that sharper. And then we'll left click, a couple of points there. So very much like if you were doing a smooth preview, and even when we beveled our low res stuff, really you're just putting some edge loops, a couple of edge loops close to each other in a corner with a rounded shape. So kind of similar principles in many respects, and just a couple different ways to do them, right? Bevel on low res. If you're using smooth preview, put edge loops close to other edge loops at corners. And even with a curve, kind of a couple of points close to each other keeps that shape sharper there. And you notice we don't have to use as much here as we kind of draw, because it's got a lot of curvature there for us. And you notice kind of I'm not going to trace this perfectly or identically, because remember, that's the foreshortening of the image. So really, kind of when you look at this, that's the actual corner, right? So right about there is probably going to be our corner shape that we can kind of start to bring into kind of probably the center here, all right? And then we can go down further. And keep in mind that there's a lot of foreshortening here, so this is actually rounded from the top view, but from a side view, it's actually going to be pretty much a straight edge. So we're kind of putting a few points in there. Kind of get out to here, a couple points at the corner, right? And then we can kind of slowly put some more points down here. And then we can slowly kind of start to bring these out. Remember, you don't have to trace, in this case in particular, exact tracing is probably not going to be your ideal method. I'll put one more close to there. And you see how here we kind of have to interpret. Notice that that's going to be a sharp edge, right? But we can see we've traced that, right? And we made sure to put a couple of extra points where the corners get a little sharper, right? Because that keeps the sharpness of the shape. But we just left click, left click, left click, left click to draw the points. And when we're happy, we hit enter. And that actually makes our curve for us, right? So now we've got our basic curve. Now I'm going to tap spacebar, and I'm going to put my cursor back over perspective view, tap spacebar again. And we can see that that's nicely kind of right on the 0 of the world. You notice when I drew it out, I made sure to draw it so that it was off of the 0, right? Because that's, when you revolve, it's going to, by default, it's going to use that 0, right, of the x-axis. All right, in this case, I'm going to go File, Save Scene As really quick because we've got this started and we want to save it. Now, the nice thing is you see how it goes right to Project 4 for us, Scenes. In this case, I'm just going to click on that one because I've already got most of the naming convention for it. And I just undo the chair part and call it Fan, right? But you see how we've got that naming convention, DA Intro to 3D Modeling 240, underscore Summer 20, underscore your name, underscore Project 4, and then underscore the actual name of that particular model you're building. So basically your naming convention should be, if not identical to this, if it's really close, I usually am fine, right, any points. If it's pretty far off, like you just call it Fan, guys, that's where you get those little points at the bottom, right, and the rubrics there off, because as much as at the end of the day a naming convention doesn't make your model nice, it is a part of being organized, particularly when you're working with a team of people, which generally you will be. And so we're trying to kind of build this habit into even in an intro class. So save as, there we go. Continue, and now we've got that project saved. Now at this point we need to do a revolve on this. Now remember, F is frame selection, right? So that kind of just zooms your cursor in on that curve, right? And remember, of course, Alt left mouse button moves your camera. Alt middle mouse button moves it, whereas Alt left rotates it, right? And Alt right mouse button zooms. So remember, your mouse should have a left and a right, but there is a scroll wheel, usually on most default mouses. And of course, you can use that as a scroll wheel, and that does a zoom, but it's a jumpy zoom. But if you press it down like a button, right, Alt middle mouse, and you just press it down like it's a button, it's actually a middle mouse button, right? I know I've mentioned that a bunch of times in these videos, but never hurts to have that stuff reinforced. But remember, Alt and your 3 mouse buttons do navigation. Just like Q is selection, W is move, E is rotate, R is scale. All right? So I'll just hit Q to put it back in the selection. And we're going to revolve this now, right? And you might even notice that it feels like I actually probably made my shaft a little too short here. So remember, if you need to, you can, your curve selected is green. If you put your cursor over this and you hold down right mouse button, right, it'll bring up its own marking menu, right? So remember, when you hold down right mouse button, that's your marking menus. And you'll see that this is very much just like when we work with polygons, because it's the same kind of menu, it's just, now it's doing it for a curve. So you can see there's control vertex there. So what I can do is I can easily just, left click drag for my pick marquee to select those vertices, and I can always just, grab the green arrow, move them up, right? So remember, you can actually, of course, adjust your curves, right, and the points on the curves. So if you find you maybe drew something a little short, hold down your cursor over the object, control vertex, boom, and you can kind of just shape those. In this case, I'm going to go back to object mode, right? Hold down right mouse button, object mode, because it's important that this is an object mode to do the revolve. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to revolve this, right? So make sure you're in object mode. But remember, if you select your object, if you put your cursor right over the object and you hold down right mouse button, it's got your selection types. Object mode should be green. And of course, we go to the surfaces menu, right? Because this is where all of our surface stuff is at, right? If you ever needed to bend or curl a curve, you can. You can even attach and detach, right? Much like you can with surface stuff as well, right? Not just select an ice palm or not. You'll even see that there is an insert knot feature. And there is one called add points tool, but that adds it at the end. So if you kind of draw one and then you need to continue it, just go to add points tool, and you'll notice that you can keep kind of adding points to the end there, right? In this case, I didn't want to do that, but you can do that, right? So just keep in mind that there are some options for working with curves and surfaces if you need to, right? We're not going super in depth in these. I'm just going to use some of the basics, right? But insert knot is there. That would be just kind of like a, you can go to, say, a curve point, right? And you can just kind of just drag a point wherever you want to on here, right? So we can put one right there. And then if we were to go to curves, insert knot, you'll see that now if we go to control vertex, there's another control vertex there. That's very much like that insert ice palm. Remember when I kind of showed you insert ice palm when we did a brief demonstration of NURB surfaces on our earlier project splines? Kind of showed you how you could select an ice palm and then insert it, right? That's kind of the curve equivalent, right? Insert knot. And even if you selected a point, like say that point selected, if you go to curves and you say detach, I think you actually might have to do edit point. Go to edit point, and you see that there are kind of different points here. You have edit points, right? And if you go to curves and detach, if you select an edit point, it detaches that into two separate curves, right? Do you need to do any of this stuff for what we're doing here? No. This is one of those things where you could totally ignore what I just did. But I just want to make sure to kind of point out a couple of these things are available to you if you want to take advantage of them, right? So remember, you can detach. You can even attach. That would actually kind of merge them together, right? Combine, but it also would merge vertices or control vertices. So that's what attached would do. Detach separates them. And you can even insert knots or even add points to the end. Now, those are probably the big ones that you would use on a curve if you wanted to make little adjustments to it. All right, but that's stuff you didn't have to do, right? You didn't have to insert a knot. You didn't have to add points at the end. You didn't have to attach or detach. I just want to make sure to point out a few more of those tools with curves since we have kind of talked about some of those equivalents in surfaces. So we go to surfaces, of course, because this is what we actually want to do, right? And we want to go to revolve. And we want to go to the options box for revolve. There we go. And we see that it brings up our axes. In this case, we want to revolve this around this direction, right? That's the y-axis, so that's good by default. We want it to be a full cylinder, so 0 to 360, right? So the defaults for this should be fine. In fact, the defaults usually are fine for this. The only thing you might ever really change most of the time is if you wanted to make like a tire for a car, you might do it on the Z or the x-axis, so it'll be kind of revolve on its side. But then you would also draw it kind of from the side as well, right? So we're going to scroll down because we do want to output as polygons, right? We want to output as polygons. Remember, by default, it outputs as NURBs. In this case, since we've been using this Maya for a while, it kind of remembers these settings, right? But we want to output polygons, right? And we want the type to be quads, right? We want the tessellate method to be general because then we can actually tell it how many edge loops to have in the horizontal and vertical directions. In this case, because there's kind of areas where we have more vertices and areas where we have less, remember it's going to be better to use per span, which I actually use most of the time, right? I prefer per span. Because what it does is it puts this number of edge loops in between each vertex. Now, if you're using per span, you should have low numbers, like 1 or 2, right? I'll use 2 for both directions. If you're using per surf, right, that's going to create that number for the whole entire surface. So if you're doing a really clean, super uniform, simpler shape, per surface will work pretty well. You just want a higher number, right? But remember, output polygons. We want quads. We want general, right? And we've done this a couple times now. We did it on our loft for our bed. We did it for our revolve for our lamp, right? Remember how we did 2 revolves for our lamp and our lampshade? We even did it with our bi-rail, right? And we did our little kind of exercise 1, our little kind of half boat shape that we made, right? Just to show you how to do a bi-rail. So remember, but this is important, right? Quads, because we like quads, right? A lot. And general just gives you the most control while still creating a nice quad clean mesh. Standard fit is the worst, right? It'll create a bunch of n-gons. So I like output polygons, quads, general, and in most cases per span is better because you usually are going to have more vertices or less vertices in areas, and per span is much more adaptive. It puts more where there's more. You do want low numbers in the UNV for that though. So we'll hit revolve, and there we go. And indeed, revolve is one of my favorite spline modeling tools, right? You guys remember when I did the exercise 1 video? I'm not a bi-rail fan. Extruding bridging border edges like we did for our clock radio and even used a couple of other areas, it's a lot faster and easier to get the same kind of results. And a lot of car modelers do it that way nowadays. Some do it the old bi-rail fashion way, but not right or wrong, just multiple right ways, but the extrude bridge border edge is a lot faster, a lot easier, a lot more flexible. You get real-time feedback. For me, just a lot more advantages. But revolve, just like our extrude, remember we did extrude for our core, kind of revolve and the extrude, particularly when you use tube, are definitely the two excellent spline modeling features here. We saw how easy it was to trace that shape and get a nice cylinder. Now, generally, when you do stuff with the revolve, right, or anything, it does kind of have them inverted, right? You see the normals are kind of facing outward. You can see that there's gray and then there's black, right? So gray is kind of your normal direction side, and black is the back face, right? Remember how we have kind of the back face culling we showed off in earlier things? See how it kind of makes, it doesn't show the back face? Usually more useful to have that on when you're kind of, like we said, when we did our room. But how do you flip those normals out? Well, remember if you go to mesh display, that's where we have the soften and harden edge. When we have kind of faceted areas in low res, we don't want them, we can soften, right? That just kind of blends the normals between polygons to kind of create a continuous shading effect instead of kind of a broken up shading effect. Harden edge, we do the broken because it's kind of using 0 as your angle between the edges. But remember, there is mesh display reverse. So in mesh display, certain things like harden and soften edge are really useful. If you want to control the angle, it's right there. But reverse, right? Reverse is also quite useful. There we go. And that just reversed those normals to face the opposite direction. And there we go. And that's basically that part, right? I'm going to show you 1 or 2 more things here in a minute. But remember, if you go to Channel Box Layer Editor, there is history, right? There's the polynormal flip, because that's the most recent thing we did. There's the revolve, right? So if you wanted to actually change these, remember, you can go to your Channel Box Layer Editor input section. Here's your history. This is everything you've done to the object so far. The first thing is at the bottom. That's the revolve. The second thing we did was the NURBS tessellate. You see how that's actually your convert to polygons. If I type in a higher number for, say, the U, right, like say 5, you see that adds a lot more edge loops that direction. So this is when history can be quite cool, right? Let me undo that. Let me go back in here, type in 2 again. So you can go back and adjust history if you need to. And there's your polynormal, which is just reverse, right? But you can even go to revolve, and you can say like, hey, let's do 180 for the end revolve, and you see how it kind of just does half a shape. Now, at this point, you'll notice that nothing really negative is happening with the history. There's only a handful of things, and they're not really overlapping functions, right? Like if you did a bunch of extrusions here, and then you went and did a bunch of extrusions on the faces you extruded out, and then you went and put a bunch of multi-cuts and edge loops or bevels on those faces you extruded. The moment you go back to earlier extrusions, it's going to destroy that part of the model. So history modeling, most of the time, actually is not useful at all. It's actually quite destructive. But in certain instances like this, it's actually quite useful. And remember, that history does, and I know I've talked about this before, but this is kind of one of the last times we're really going to talk about it in spline modeling, so might as well. Remember, if you go back to the curve, you can actually adjust the curve, and it adjusts the original shape, because this shape is a child of this. It's kind of like the curve is the parent, this is the child, right? So whatever you do to this one, it will affect that one. So remember, that's kind of what history's doing with all of that stuff, right? If you want to, of course, even now, right? Because sometimes if you have a lot of history, it could slow down Maya, it could take longer to load scenes in. So even though I usually show you kind of deleting history at the end, because we don't really build too complicated models usually, it's something you could periodically do, right? If you're having weird issues with your software, or maybe Smooth Preview's acting up a little bit, it's sometimes one of those things where it's just great to just, kind of grab everything and just go edit, delete by type history. It's got a quick key, which means you should probably be using it quite often. So you can periodically just delete history as you're working, right? If you don't need it anymore. In fact, now I can just click on that curve and delete it if I want to, and we're good. The only other thing I'd want to do is, you see how there's like this little opening here at the end? Remember, I can go to edge selection mode, right? So hold down right mouse button of the object, edge. I could double click on one of these edges because it selects the border edge loop. And we can go to edit mesh, right? And remember, we've seen a little bit of the merge function, right? We kind of showed it off a little bit on the clock radio. I feel like I showed it off on another scene as well. But remember, in edit mesh, you have merge functionality, right? Usually you don't need these that often, right? If you're using a lot of merging, you might be doing it harder than you need to, right? But there's times when you're going to need it, right? And in this case, since I just want these all to merge to the very center of the selection, merge center is going to be great. But if you do go to merge options box, it gives you an actual threshold, kind of a size, right? And the bigger that size is, the more it'll merge things that are closer to the bigger that threshold is, the more it'll merge stuff. So if I made it like pretty small, doesn't even do anything, right? Barely grabbed anything. I could try to make it a little smaller than that. You just have to kind of keep tinkering with that, right? In this case, it's going to be easier for me just to merge to center because it'll automatically select that whole edge loop and merge it down to a single vertex. So remember, merge is actually a merge tool, right? Those several vertices there are now one. So that kind of is a great little way to close off that little end if you need to. This one we don't need to because it's not really close to the top. But that bottom one kind of was. So merge to center, great little way to kind of easily do that. But remember, there is merge that gives you an options box. There's even target weld functionality, right? If you go back to modeling toolkit, there is something called target weld. And you could actually just left click drag to kind of target weld stuff, right? So keep that in mind that you even have target weld, which is just merging, but it's based on targets, right? So just a little bit more about the merging functionality there. Just want to really make sure you guys have got an understanding of those things. All right, in this case, see, maybe I didn't get this crease as much, so I can always just go back to edge selection mode, and I can just double click on that edge loop, right? Hit R for scale, scale it in a little bit, just kind of define that crease a little bit more. If you wanted to, you could always add an extra edge loop, right? Remember, if you go to multi-cut, there is that edge flow feature, and if you go to hold down Control to put an edge loop in, you'll notice it kind of will kind of push the shape in or out. In this case, that's just kind of pushing it in slightly. So keep in mind that you have edge flow if you need it. It doesn't always work perfectly though. It's kind of one of those things where it's useful to have, but you're not always going to get exactly the result you wanted. In this case, I feel like I want to kind of bring these back up, maybe scale it out a little bit, right? So remember, just double left click on an edge, it selects an edge loop, and you just scale it out or move it down or up. And so that gave me a little more of the roundness I wanted. So edge flow is quite useful, but there are plenty of times when it's not going to give you the results you want. So keep that in mind. But pretty easy just to bevel or add some extra edge loops, just do a little bit of scaling and shaping to kind of get that stuff. All right. So there we go. I think that'll be a great place to stop this video, and then we'll make the ceiling fans next.